Today on Howtoautomotive, we're going to be replacing a turbo on a Lincoln Navigator. This is the same process for the F-150 or a Ford Expedition with a 3.5 liter turbo engine, 2013 and newer. We're going to be doing the passenger side turbo. This car didn't have any performance issues, just a turbo whine as you can hear here, especially when you jump on the accelerator. We're going to be using a BorgWarner replacement turbo. I will link it up in the description of the video, along with any other parts and tools that I think will be handy for you guys. Later on in the process, we're going to remove the starter, so we need to disconnect the negative battery cable, and then we can go ahead and pop this top engine cover off. So what we're going to do is take the oil cap off here, unscrew it, and then you can lift this engine cover up and then pull out. Now that we got the engine cover off, we're going to go ahead and put the oil cap back on. Next, we're going to get started by removing the right front wheel. So if you're doing this at the shop, go ahead and rack your vehicle up. If you're doing it at home, use floor jacks and jack stands to get the right front wheel off. You want that suspension to hang down. Now we're going to work on getting the inner fender liner removed. There's some fasteners around the outside perimeter and a couple here in the middle. Also, some wires are clipped to the inside of the fender. We're going to pop those off, and then we're going to pull this lining out. The best way to get to the wiring harness is go under the hood and pull off the ABS sensors or mount it to the inside of the fender lining here. And you'll see a couple of them over here. Just pop those out and just let them rest. So the fasteners around the outside perimeter of the fender lining were 7mm. The smaller ones that are on the inside were 7/32. So go ahead and rip out those bolts. Also in the left bottom corner, there was a clip that I had to pop off. So now with the liner off, as you can see, we got complete access to the turbo here. I'm going to get started by removing the inlet air and charge pipe hose clamps here, loosen these up, and then we're going to push these pipes off. 8mm wobbly socket and a long extension made quick work of that. Now that I got the clamps loose, I'm going to go back up top right here. I use a tire here to stand on it to help me get up in here and reach in here. I'm going to pull the inlet tube off first. I'm also going to loosen the clamp here. Also, if you follow the pipe down, there's going to be a vacuum hose right here. We need to pull this off and just tuck it off to the side. So now you can separate the pipe here. Once you get that separated, then you're going to pull and twist until you get the pipe to remove. So as I'm pulling the charge pipe out, it was fighting me a little bit, but the way I got it out was I reached down there and pulled the cooler pipe off of the end of the turbo, and that gave me a little bit more slack to get it out. I also used a bungee cord to hold it up and out of our way while we're working on it. Now back from the side view here, we're going to pull off the vacuum hose from the turbo wastegate, and we'll just tuck it off to the side. So next we need to disconnect the oil line going to the turbo, and also there's a couple coolant lines that we need to disconnect. Before we disconnect those, we want to take the lower shields off that's underneath the vehicle. We're just going to remove the fasteners around the perimeter of the shield. Now we're going to remove the bolts on the back side of the bell housing here to drop the starter down. There's one bolt and nut holding the transmission cooler lines, or the cooler lines here. So I'm going to remove the 10mm nut here, and then once I get this removed, then I'll pull the cooler line bracket here off the stud. And then once I get this pulled off and just pushed off to the side, now I can remove the 13mm bolt here on the top and bottom. Now once I get the bolts removed, I'm going to work the starter down and lay it down on top of the sway bar here and see if I can work around it. I'm not going to take the wires off of it. I'm going to leave them all hooked up. So my original thought was I'll try to work around the starter, just leave it in this cavity here and just work around it. And I probably could have, but for filming and also it was just a little bit in my way, so I decided later on in the video to drop the sway bar down and let this take this starter all the way out. Now we have access to the 15mm bolts going to the exhaust manifold, and also we can get to the oil cooler lines. Before we do all that, I'm going to recommend that you spray them down with some penetrating oil. I like the PB Blaster brand. Once you get that done, you can go ahead and loosen up the bolts for the exhaust manifold. They're 15mm nuts. I'm using a extension and a ratchet. So like I said, I discovered that the starter was still too much in my way, so I'm going to drop this sway bar down here by removing the bolts on the left and right side here. And once this is unbolted here at the frame, we can just let the sway bar swing down and just hang. Now with the sway bar disconnected, we can remove the starter here or work it out into the open here. And I'm going to use a bungee cord and just bungee cord it up like this, and this will hold it in place. I'm not going to disconnect the wiring. I'm just going to leave it all hooked up. As you remember, we got the battery disconnected up top. So now we have access to this tube here that goes up and feeds to the bottom of the turbo here. This is the oil line here, the oil drain back line and oil pressure line. So we're going to remove the two fasteners holding it on here. These are E45 Torx bolts. We just need to remove the two upper ones, not the lower bolt. On the back side of the turbo, it's a little hard to see here, but there's a coolant hose, and I'm going to show you how to get that off. We're going to go on the front and get the front one off first. So if you look right here is the coolant line coming in. We need a pick tool, and we're going to pick out a clip that's mounted right here and pick this out, and then we can pop this hose out. Here's a closer look on the new turbo here of what the clips looks like. So your new turbo should come with the clips, so don't worry about losing them. But if you're reinstalling a turbo, make sure you don't lose those clips. There's going to be one on the front and one on the back. So you're going to need some good lighting and two sharp picks to pick this clip out. I use one pick to pull the clip forward and then one pick to get behind it and then pull it the rest of the way out. Now that I got the pick out, I'm going to use a screwdriver or a small pry bar, and I'm not going to pry on the line to pull it up. I'm just going to wiggle it, try to get it free and pull up on it. Now as you can see, the coolant is running out. I have a bucket underneath the vehicle. This is going to take a few minutes to drain this all out. While that's draining, I'm going to go ahead and take off the top bolt here for the exhaust manifold. We took off the lower one earlier from underneath. I just used a 15mm socket and a flex head ratchet to get this off. If you also take the radiator cap off, that coolant will drain a lot faster and speed the process up. Now that it's done draining, I use some compressed air to dry it off as best I can. That way it's not dripping on me when I'm taking this out. Now back underneath, looking up towards the turbo, I'm going to get to that line that goes in the very back of the turbo, get the clip out. I'm using the pick tool, so I'm going to do the same thing as I did on the top line. Pull this clip out. Once we get the clip pulled out, we're not going to pull or pry onto the hose. We'll unbolt the whole turbo and pull away from the hose. Now that we got the clip off, now I'm going to take the three mounting bolts that mount to the manifold off right here. I'm going to use a little penetrating oil on those before I do it. So you're going to need an extension, a T50, Torx socket to remove these three bolts. So the 1, 2, 3 right here in the corners. We're going to remove all three of these. I would recommend breaking these free by hand. If you use an impact, you could strip or round out that bolt, then you're in a lot of trouble. Now with the turbo unbolted, I'm using a pry bar on the exhaust manifold here to pry it back off the end of the turbo here. I'm just putting the pry bar on the bell housing of the transmission and lightly prying it. And now we're going to wiggle and maneuver the turbo out as we pry the exhaust back just a little bit. We're also pulling the turbo towards the outside of the vehicle to get that hose on the back side that was connected for the coolant line to disengage. So you'll pull towards you, wiggle, slide it towards the front, wiggle it, and kind of twist it, and you'll find that sweet spot angle and it'll come right out. It took a couple of minutes to wiggle it and angle it to get it out, but now it's out, I noticed a problem. So if you look at the bolt on the very end of the exhaust manifold here is missing, and when I took the turbo out, I found it laying down here on the frame. And if you run across a problem like this, it's something you definitely want to address and not just put your turbo back in. It will be exhaust leak down the road if it isn't already. In this particular case, we went ahead and decided that we're going to drill this out, retap it, and install a new stud on it. We also did a little research and we found that there is problems with these warping, causing the bolt to break and also causing turbo noises that can mimic the actual turbo being bad, but it's actually the manifold. So we decided it would be best to remove the manifold. There's only a handful more bolts on here that we need to take off. So we're going to take off these bolts, pull the manifold out, put a straight edge on it and check it for warpness. And also it gives us a little more access to get to that bolt on the end that's broken, drill that out and get that removed. So here we have the manifold out. We got a straight edge on it, and as you can see, it's pretty badly warped. And this may or may not seal. So the root cause of our noise was actually not a turbo. It was the gasket here acting like a reed valve, vibrating really fast as the turbo spooled up, causing that whine noise. So our turbo had no performance issues, it just had that noise. So I did a thorough inspection of the turbo, checked the bearings, checked everything on the turbo, and everything seemed to be in perfect working condition. So we knew for sure that the turbo was not a problem. It was the manifold here. So we're going to drill it out, get a new manifold, new gasket, put that on there. So I'm going to install the manifold right now. I'll walk you through step by step through that process. If you don't need this portion of the video, skip ahead to the installation of the turbo. So we ordered up all new studs, bolts, and the new manifold. I will link these all up in the description of the video. That way, if your vehicle needs any of those, you can find those parts and part numbers. So I unboxed the manifold here and put it on my top of my toolbox here. You can see how nice and flat it is versus how warped the old version was. So I drilled and tapped out the broken hole here. Now we're going to install new studs on all of these here. They have a little hex drive on the end that you can put a socket on there to remove the studs. Then you bolt up your manifold with your new gasket. There's a very specific torque pattern that we need to follow to torque this down. So I printed out a diagram of how the manifold is torqued down. We're just going to follow this exact steps here. It's done in 2 stages. So the first stage of torquing, we're going to do it at 14 foot-pounds or 168 inch-pounds or 19 Newton meters, depending on what type of torque wrench you own. On stage 2, we're going to torque it down to the exact same pattern, but bumped up the torque to 18 foot-pounds. So there's just enough room to get a torque wrench in here. You have to use a little extension like this, and you can torque them down to those two rounds and those exact pattern that I showed in the diagram before. Now you're ready to either install your old turbo back on because that wasn't the problem, or install the new turbo. So in our case, we talked to the customer about the problems that we found, and he decided he wanted to go with the new turbo and go ahead and install that because the vehicle had high mileage and he could not afford to have his truck down, so he wanted to put the new turbo in. So we're going to get started by transferring over some of the old parts to the new turbo. We need to get these studs off and this flange transferred over to the new turbo. So I soaked these in penetrating oil. I got a special socket here that fits on the end here to remove the studs, and I used a pair of vice grips down at the bottom to help crack this free. It felt like it was twisting the stud as I was trying to loosen it with just the socket alone. And then so I got this loose, and now I'm going to transfer this directly over to the new turbo. So we transferred the flange housing over with a new gasket to the new turbo and bolted it up. One other thing we need to do is we need to transfer over the heat shields from the old turbo to the new turbo. Now we're going to clip our new gasket onto the back of the turbo here, which this is where it mounts to the manifold. The oil cooler line underneath, we'll put that gasket on later on in the process. If you look here, the clips are already pre-mounted into the cooling passages here. I left those clips in. I lubricated the fittings here with some silicone-based grease here to help the lines slide in. When we push the lines in, they flare those clips out, and then they pop back into place and hold the lines in. If they do fight you, you can take these clips off, put the line in, and then put the clips back in. It's a little harder that way. Also on this turbo, there's an ear mounted here. This is for a different model. Probably the older models had a mount back there. So we don't have to be concerned with that bracket. Now what we're going to do is install it, but we need to focus on this coolant line right here. It needs to stab right here. It needs to stab into the back of the fitting here. So we need to line that up kind of first and then push it in towards the manifold. And as we bolt it up and push it in, it'll clip into place. Also, we may go from underneath and give it a little pry to get it to go in. So now I'm going to put the turbo back into position, snake it in here. And at the same time, I'm lining up the manifold, and I'm making sure that that pipe on the back is stabbing into the back of the turbo. So this is probably the hardest part. You got to make sure the gasket doesn't fall off. It's stabbed in the back of the turbo here, the cooling line here. I'm underneath looking back up just to make sure everything's lining up. And then I'm use the bell housing pry bar and pry this back to get the fittings to fit on here. Once I got all that aligned, then what I'll do is I'll finally line up the bolts here and start the 3 bolts, the mounting bolts here on it. I won't draw them all the way in and tighten them up yet. So at this point, I'm just making sure that all the fittings are fitting into the right place. Everything is loose but mounted. And then once I finally get things situated where I like it, then I'll start slowly drawing the bolts in. I also wanted to point out where you grab, you want to pay attention. The gasket sticks out, and that thing is super sharp and will cut you. Now I have these bolts run in about 75–80% in. I got all the fittings started on the back here and the coolant line on the back. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go underneath the vehicle, and with a pry bar we're going to pry that line into the turbo here just to make sure it's fully seated. And then we can keep drawing the turbo in towards the manifold, tightening it up and making sure. And you're just going to double, triple check that that line has clipped in. Now that clip up there on the back side of the cooling hose should be installed already. If you had any problems, you could take that clip out, install the line, and push the clip back in. It's a little difficult doing it because it's a tight area. Now we're going to go ahead and run these down and tighten those up. Now we can install the gasket for the oil line. If you notice, there's 2 holes for the oil. You got to make sure you line the gasket up right. So you'll slide the gasket in between the turbo and the fitting here, and then start the two bolts. And we'll run these in and tighten them up to 6 foot-pounds and about a 1/4 turn more. The 3 mounting bolts here are torqued down to 25 foot-pounds. I did it in a cross pattern. Now we're going to get the front coolant line to go in. We're going to line it up with the fitting here. And then what we're going to use is a little bit of a pry tool, a pry bar, screwdriver, and kind of pry from the top of the line and wiggle it and pry down until it seats into the fitting. If you need to, take the clip out, put the clip back in later. I use one hand to stabilize the line and keep it where I want it, and the other hand to pry with a screwdriver or a pry tool till it popped into place. Now that that's re-secured, we can go ahead and mount the 2 15mm nuts for the exhaust flange here, and we can tighten these up. I like to draw these in equally, front, back, until it's fully snug, and then tighten them up. Now you can plug the vacuum hose back into the wastegate. Now we can take our starter and put it back up into position and bolt it up. You can remount the cooler lines and snug that up. Now you can take the 4 mounting bolts here and swing the sway bar back up into position and start the 4 fasteners for that. I like to start all 4 fasteners. Once they're all started, then I just work back and forth trying to draw them in equally and tighten them up. Now you can go ahead and install the undershield. Just the bolts around the perimeter, run them in until they're snug and tighten them up. Now we can go ahead and install the inlet and cooler pipe. So I fed the inlet pipe down through into position. It took a little bit of twisting to get it to go in there. Got it to go in there. Now underneath, I'm going to mount it on the lower one first here. So after the inlet pipe is on and secure, then we'll go back up top, secure it here. Also going to plug the vacuum hose right here that we took off. We're going to plug that back in, and then we'll go back underneath and put the cooler pipe on and make sure that that's secure, and make sure that the 2 clamps are secure on both of the pipes. Now we can fill it up with Ford approved coolant. It's an orange coolant that goes into this model. We're going to fill that up to the full mark right there. Now we can reconnect the negative battery cable here. And before we start the vehicle, we're going to prime the turbo with oil, and I'm going to walk you through that steps. To do that, what we're going to do is put it in clear flood mode. So we're going to hold the accelerator pedal down, hold our foot on the brake. This will allow the engine to crank without starting.
Foot on the brake.
So the accelerator is fully to the floor. Foot on the brake pedal. Now you can hear the engine cranking. This is priming the oil, pushing the oil into the turbo. So when we start it off for the first time, it's not dry. Now we can start the vehicle up and run it. Now with the engine running, we're going to inspect for coolant leaks, oil leaks, exhaust leaks, any of those, and address any of that may be concerned. In our case, we're in good shape. No exhaust leaks, no oil leaks, no coolant leaks. So now we're ready to go ahead and put the fender lining back in. So I went ahead and shut the vehicle off, put the top engine cover back on, and then it just hooks there in the back, presses down, make sure you take the oil cap back off to do that. And then once you got that done, now we can take the fender lining here. We're going to reinstall that. That hooks up underneath the lip of the fender here. And then don't forget to plug in all the electrical connectors and all the fasteners. Once you get that all secure, put your wheel back on, and now you're ready to go for a test drive. As you can hear, as quiet as can be on ours. So I will link the parts and tools up in the description of the video. I'm Brian Eslick from Howtoautomotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Encourage you to subscribe. And click the bell notification. That way you're notified as soon as I upload a new valuable video like this. Thank you again for watching.